He struggled and everything, but he wasn't a bad guy.
A young man dies in a Montreal jail. The bail hearing for Narissa and Odelia Cuzons wraps up in Yorkton. And another court battle over medical records is brewing in British Columbia. Good evening, I'm Priscilla Wolf. Welcome to APTN National News. According to a coroner's report obtained by APTN, the 2020 death of a 44-year-old Inuk man at Montreal's Bordeaux jail might have been prevented had proper procedures been followed. With another recent death making headlines, questions are starting to swirl around how the jail treats its detainees. Tom Fernario has the story.
He was only 23 when he made this.
For the first time in a while, Annie Hickey Konajwak is about to watch her brother's documentary. Back in 1999, Bobby Konajwak directed My Village in Nunavik for the National Film Board. At the time, Bobby was just 23 years old. In homage to his hometown of Pervernatuk, the film shows a side of the Inuit community 1,600 kilometers northwest of Montreal that few ever see.
When you hear about us in the South, it is often through stories of disaster and human suffering. While this does exist, there is far more a kind of joy we take from being together.
Being together is something Annie wishes she could do with Bobby, but she can't. In 2020, Bobby died in Montreal's Bordeaux jail. He was 44 years old.
I think it's not fair. He needed help and support, and he struggled and everything, but he wasn't a bad guy.
According to the coroner's report summary, Bobby Konajwak died in jail on July 11, 2020, after being picked up by police for aggressive and disorganized behavior in a Montreal business. The report concludes that Konajwak likely died of a severely irregular heartbeat exasperated by alcohol withdrawal. But the report also criticizes guards and management for not immediately bringing him to the infirmary. According to the coroner, Konajwak's heavy perspiration, shortness of breath, and state of confusion were among the symptoms they ignored. It also notes that guards left Konajwak on the floor of his cell for over 11 hours without checking on him because inmates frequently sleep on the floor during heat waves. Coroner Karin Spinard writes that leaving a detainee on the floor for hours when they have already shown signs of physical duress is counter to a directive that states the role of correctional services officers is, in particular, to ensure that inmates are alive and healthy.
Like, who are these people? Like, you know, they're looking at someone and saying, like, it doesn't matter, like, I'm not going to do this job. Every community needs a skilled accordion player. Bobby was one of them.
After some hesitation, Annie has decided to share Bobby's story. For one, she wants people to know that Bobby wasn't just someone who struggled with addiction and being homeless. But she also felt compelled to speak out following another recent death at the same jail. On Christmas Eve, 21-year-old detainee Nikos Dandre Spring died after guards pepper sprayed him twice while he was wearing a spit hood, a kind of mesh mask that is used to prevent biting and spitting. In Spring's case, Quebec's head coroner has called a public inquiry.
I feel like it's the right thing to do, and I feel like there should be repercussions.
Annie feels her brother's case has elements in common with Spring's. Specifically, they both show a lack of care and respect by the guards who failed to follow their own procedures and protocols.
I reached out to the organization that is assisting his family, and I just wanted to let them know that they are not alone. And that's why I was wondering, like, was it the same guard? Was it the same guard working that night?
Bobby's coroner report, released over 2 years after his death, notes that Quebec's Public Security Internal Investigations Division took appropriate measures with regards to the officer on duty the night of Bobby's death. They have also recommended that the supervisor be reminded of his obligations as a manager. Quebec's Ministry of Public Security, who oversee Bordeaux, declined our requests for comment.
I question the training, what the procedures are, the note-taking.
Michael Arruda has spent 25 years as a Montreal police officer and now works as a crisis intervention consultant. He says that it's too soon to make a direct link between the Spring and Konajwak cases, but they point to issues that need addressing.
I'm also concerned about the supervision. In both of these cases, there was a supervisor, management, that was at the scene and took some decisions and I'm wondering, are they qualified? What are the training for these supervisors when they're in the middle of this, when they're supposed to be guiding the agents?
As for Annie, who lives just outside of Montreal, she's grateful that there's still a piece of Bobby to be found online. Something that celebrates a place and people that he held dear.
As soon as the nice weather comes, the women love to go line fishing.
Watching it makes me want to go back. I'll definitely visit his grave, like when I go to Bufunijuk again.
Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Montreal.
This week, we covered the bail hearing for Narissa and Ardelia Cusance in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. They were convicted of second-degree murder in 1993 for the killing of Anthony Dolph. In 1994, they were sentenced to life in prison. They are still in federal custody, but say they were wrongfully convicted because a cousin later confessed to the crime. Last year, Justice Minister David Lametti ordered a review saying there may have been a possible miscarriage of justice. The sisters want to be free on bail during the review. Kim Bowden is Vice Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. He was at the hearing. Thank you so much, Vice Chief, for joining us. It's been a long journey for the Cusance sisters. Was this past week promising? And what was the bail hearing like?
It was promising. Unfortunately, it's taken a long time, right? We've been addressing this issue close to over 2 years now. In terms of there was a lot of supporters that were at the courthouse, and that was really good to see. And I remember the comment made by the judge. He had indicated that he's never been involved in this kind of a process before, a judicial, like a review in terms of the bail hearing 30 years after the fact. So it was quite new to him. Yeah.
And it's unfortunate about the judge going on vacation. When will we find out more?
Well, I believe between probably 6 to 8 weeks. I'm not holding my collective breath on that one. I can, the wheels of justice always works very slow, and he indicated that it was a very, somewhat of a complicated decision, that he's going to look at the criminal code and how to address that code and see whether, it fits the merits of releasing them. And so, yeah, there's different grounds for release, right? So that's kind of what he's going to do. He said in court that he's not going to look at any media coverage or what the media said and advocates and that kind of thing. That's kind of what he said. He goes, I'm not going to weigh my decision based on that. So it was quite interesting. I don't know if you know this, if you're aware of this, but this is very rare. I mean, it doesn't happen where 30 years later that there's a bail hearing that would be, called for. That does not happen I can't even remember. So, yeah.
It is rare,
yeah,
yes.
It's very rare.
It sounds like one of the big issues brought up was the aftercare of the sisters once they're freed. Now, you spoke up and you offered to help. Can you explain?
Yes, yes, I knew that was going to be an issue. I was very concerned because the courts tend to use that as an excuse for not releasing somebody. They'll say, well, they don't have nowhere to go. There's nowhere for them to, in a safe place. And so that's why they keep them. So that's why I offered my place, and I thought it was important. I used to run a mental health approved home. I had numerous clients. They were very high level clients in terms of the level of care. So this is not, new and scary to me at all. I mean, and I really was concerned she would have nowhere to go. And I also knew too and I have a lot of connections as well. So I thought it would be important that I could connect with those connections in the community to address the other issues. Yes, to address other issues that would come into play. So yeah, that's why I did that. So we'll see what happens.
Now, Vice Chief, help for people who return home after being in prison has been an issue. What changes do you think need to happen to help the Cusance sisters if or when they are released?
Well, it's a huge issue, and when you've been institutionalized for over 40 years, close to 40 years, and you throw in the issue of residential schools, and then combine that now with respect to the various the prison system, yeah, it's been almost 40 years, and that's a long time. And So we can't just assume, and then this is what bothers me too. Sometimes the courts or the corrections, for example, just assume that you're just going to be normal, everything's going to be like nothing, and when you get out, and they're assuming dead wrong. So we need to provide assistance. We need to provide resources, especially resources, and we want to ensure that they're supported when they do get out. And talking with, I really believe that both of them are going to, they will be all right. Like in the end of the day, they're going to be they will be good. My discussions with both of them, I got a really good sense what they want to do when they're out, the kind of contributions actually that they want to make in terms of their journey and what happened to them in corrections, and these are all positive things that they want to do. So I thought this is great because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people, organizations who want to hear from the two sisters. There's no question about it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
APTN CEO Monica Ely is making headlines once again. Each year, Playback magazine recognizes 12 outstanding individuals who have made an impact in their sector. Today, Playback named her Executive of the Year by Canada's leading film and broadcasting magazine for keeping the network adaptable while successfully leading it through modernization, and for its mandate to represent Indigenous people. On behalf of everyone at APTN, we'd like to say congratulations, Monica. Well done. Now, time for our first break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The British Columbia Court of Appeal is hearing a case on the constitutionality of child protection services in the province having unrestricted access to parents' medical records. Provisions of the Provincial Act allow for the Director of Child Protection and their social workers to collect private information of parents. That includes medical records. Information can be collected without parents' consent or notification, and can be used to make unilateral decisions like removing children from their families. British Columbia Civil Liberties Association has been granted intervener status in the case. It's set to argue that the Act's provisions are in violation of Section 8 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Megan Giltro is a lawyer for the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, and she joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us, Megan. Can you give us some background on the case that the BCCLA is intervening in today?
Sure, and thanks for having me. This is a case that arose from the discovery, actually quite by accident, by a mother, that her healthcare records had been accessed by the Provincial Ministry of Child and Family Development, the director, without her knowledge. And it drew attention to a provision that's in the child welfare legislation in British Columbia that appears to stand quite apart from other provisions in the legislation that provide sort of protective measures and checks and balances, and that give quite open scope for the director to access really any information that the social workers deem relevant that are being held by public institutions. And in this case, that was the regional hospital, a public institution. And it draws this provision in the legislation draws a real distinction between medical records that we all have an expectation of privacy over, that are held by, for example, our doctors in their private clinics, as distinct from medical records that may be held by, for example, a hospital, and provides much more open access to the government to those records.
Okay.
And
why did the BCCLA feel it was important to intervene on this particular case?
Well, there's a real concern over protecting rights of privacy, and especially privacy over health records, including, for example, therapeutic records, mental health records. But BCCLA was particularly concerned about the context in which this state access to personal information is happening, which is the child welfare context. And as we know, that's a context where there are great imbalances on where the state's attention have been. We know that there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the child welfare system, and that was a point that West Coast Leaf intervened to make clearly before the court. But BC Civil Liberties' concern is that far from being a context where the regular checks and balances should be relaxed, we should have heightened protections in these contexts, because we know this is a sphere in which the state's intruding into the lives of families, once been recognized as one of the most intimate spheres there is in our society. And we don't want to deprive the director of information that's necessary for the protection of children, but that doesn't mean letting all safeguards fly out the window.
Okay. Well, can you explain how the current legislation in the Child, Family and Community Service Act is in breach of the Canadian Charter?
Well, it hasn't been determined yet to be in breach of the Charter, but the appellant's arguments in this case is that it does breach the Charter because it doesn't weigh the interests of protection of children with the, at the same time, interests of the protection of private personal health care information, and comes down to doesn't have sufficient safeguards in place to ensure that that really important balancing is happening. So, for example, there's no opportunity for a parent to even know that these records are being accessed, let alone to ask a court to have a look and oversee and make sure that only those records that are necessary for the protection of children, for the director to do their job, are being accessed, rather than too broad an encroachment upon personal information. So it's really, it's the safeguards. Balancing has to happen, but in the appellant's position in this case was well argued that there weren't sufficient safeguards, and so this was really just too wide open for the discretion of thousands of social workers.
Right. Now, the BCCLA claims there's a better alternative available to protect children and their families. Can you tell us about that?
Well, one thing we pointed the court to was how it's working in Ontario. Ontario has a model, for example, where when the Child Welfare Agency requires access to records in order to do their work, carry out their mandate, they have to go to court to ask for the records. They need to get an order. And that allows the court an opportunity to ensure that only the narrowest access to information is happening. And it provides a check and balance on the system. And there's good examples of the courts doing just that, doing what courts do, which is providing that safeguard. So we suggested that as showing a sort of frontline on the ground approach that is working, and in Ontario at least is not depriving the director of the records they need, is ensuring that the safety of children and families can be maintained, but is protecting the right to privacy.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Megan.
Thank you.
Time for another break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. Greg Scriver sent in this great picture that captures a very golden orange sunset where the cloud's reflection is captured by the open water along the Ottawa River. Thanks, Greg. Send us your photos right now to share at aptn.ca for the chance to be our next photo of the day. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Let's start out east. It is -2 in Fredericton and 0 in Halifax. -11 Happy Valley Goose Bay and -11 in Cartwright. -7 in Quebec City and -4 in Montreal. +1 in Toronto and -1 in London. It is -4 in Elliott Lake and -9 in Timmins. -9 in God's Lake and -6 in Thompson. -4 in Winnipeg and -4 in Brandon. -5 in Saskatoon and -8 in Regina. -4 in La Ronge, and -5 in Buffalo Narrows. -1 in Peace River, and -3 in High Level. -1 in Red Deer, +2 in Edmonton. +6 in Vancouver, and +7 in Victoria. It is -6 in Fort Nelson and +5 in Smithers. It is 0 in Whitehorse and also 0 in Watson Lake. -15 in Yellowknife and -5 in Trout Lake. It is -24 in Fort McPherson. It is -7 in Baker Lake and -8 in Chesterfield. It is -32 in Resolute and -36 in Arctic Bay. Now it's time for host Fraser Needham to tell us what will be on Nation to Nation.
The discovery of what are being called 170 plausible burials on the site of a former Indian residential school in Kenora, Ontario, hits close to home for NDP MPP Sol Mamakwe. We'll talk to him about that, as well as National Coalition of Chiefs President Del Swampy says the Liberals' climate change plan will only lead to greater poverty for First Nations people. And National Association of Friendship Centers CEO Jocelyn Swarmsma brings an Indigenous perspective to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. We'll bring up these issues on this week's episode of Nation to Nation.
APTN Investigates returns tomorrow night with an all-new episode. Journalist John Murray brings you the story of Noah Buffalo Jackson. His family has spent the last 20 years advocating for Indigenous children who have suffered in Canada's healthcare system. Here's a preview of Noah's story.
It was supposed to be one of the largest settlement agreements in history.
So, Noah regards this as his work, fighting for other kids so they don't have to go through what he's been through and that they're not alone.
$40 billion for Indigenous children who were discriminated against by Canada's child welfare and healthcare systems.
So we're really proud of him. We're really proud of his courage and his willingness to do this and to be an advocate for other kids.
A decades-long victory that, for now, has been put on hold.
Noah's, he's willing to put himself out there to be the representative so that the system changes.
You can catch the rest of Noah's story tomorrow night following the news. That's your APTN National News for January 19th. I'm Priscilla Wolf. Have a great evening.